They called him the King of New York. Luviano Udinesi didn't have a soul. He had a ledger of debts and a heart made of cold, Manhattan steel. His estate was a fortress, and his word was the only law that mattered. Rule number 1, no outsiders ever. But on a night when the sky over the city turned a bruised purple, Sheila, his terrified maid, had no other choice. She brought the only person who made her world feel whole, her grandmother, Sara, straight into the lion's den. The heavy reinforced doors groaned open as rain hammered against the cold marble of the foyer. Sheila's breath hitched as she heard his footsteps echoing through the grand hallway, steady, deliberate, and utterly merciless. Luviano appeared, blood still fresh and darkening his knuckles from a nightmare he had just finished. Then came the sound that stopped her heart, the cold, unmistakable slide and click of weapons being drawn. From upstairs, she heard the sharp, metallic chorus of his guards raising their guns, the red dots of their laser sights hunting through the dark. Every nerve in Sheila's body screamed. Without a single thought for herself, she bolted up the sweeping staircase, her feet barely touching the marble, and burst through the study door. She threw herself in front of Sara's chair, arms spread wide, placing every inch of her trembling body between the guns and her grandmother. Sheila squeezed her eyes shut, pulling Sara close, waiting for the crack of a gunshot that would end them both. But the sound never came. Instead, she heard something impossible, the rustle of expensive Italian wool hitting the floor. When she opened her eyes, the most dangerous man in New York wasn't reaching for his weapon. He was on his knees, his head bowed low before her grandmother. And on his face, for the first time in 30 years, were tears. "Nana," he whispered, his voice shattering like glass. "You're alive." Before we dive in, if this story is already pulling you in, go ahead and give it a like and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. It means the world and keeps the story coming. Now, let's get into it. The buzzing of Sheila's phone at 3 a.m. was a jagged blade cutting through the heavy silence of the servants' quarters. Her heart lurched into her throat as she saw the nursing home's number flashing on the screen, the blue light casting ghostly shadows against the walls of the mansion staff room. The voice on the other end was frantic, explaining that the facility was flooding and they had no space left in the temporary shelter. "You need to come get your grandmother now," the nurse urged. The phone nearly slipped from Sheila's trembling, sweat-slicked hands. She had nowhere to go. Her tiny apartment had been condemned weeks ago due to black mold, leaving her to sleep in the shadows of Luviano Udinesi's fortress, grateful for a bed but living in a state of constant, paralyzing terror. She threw on her coat and raced into the night, the rain-soaked streets of New York blurred by her own panicked tears. By the time she arrived at the facility, water was seeping through the corridors. Sara sat in a wheelchair by the entrance, looking small and confused, her cloudy eyes lost somewhere between the present and a past Sheila could never reach. "Nana," Sheila whispered, kneeling beside her. "We have to go." When the old woman asked where they were going, Sheila forced a lie through her twisting stomach, somewhere safe. The drive back to the Udinesi estate felt like a funeral procession, every red light a countdown to a potential execution. This was a house where strangers weren't just unwelcome, they were eliminated. Luviano had made that crystal clear months ago when a lost delivery driver was sent away in an ambulance just for ringing the service bell. Sheila parked in the back alley, her hands shaking so violently she could barely kill the engine. She helped Sara out of the car, supporting her grandmother's frail body as they crept toward the service entrance. The kitchen was a cavern of dark marble and silence. "Just for tonight," Sheila whispered to herself like a desperate prayer. Just until I figure something out. She settled Sara in a corner of the staff area, then slipped out to begin her morning rounds, her mind racing through impossible solutions as she scrubbed the floors of a man who would kill them both if he found them. The storm outside was nothing compared to the violence Luviano Udinesi brought home with him. The grand oak doors of the estate groaned as he stepped into the foyer, his silhouette framed by a jagged strike of lightning that turned the marble floors into a mirror of white fire. He didn't just walk, he loomed, the scent of expensive cologne warring with the metallic tang of fresh copper. His breathing was heavy, a ragged sound that spoke of a man who had spent the last 4 hours tearing through the city's Lower East Side to make an example of a traitor. His knuckles were split, the skin dark and swollen, and a smear of crimson decorated the lapel of his tailored suit like a macabre boutonniere. Behind him, his personal guard moved like shadows, their footsteps silent compared to the heavy, rhythmic thud of Luviano's boots. He was a man who demanded absolute silence and absolute solitude. The staff knew the rules. When the king returned, the halls were to be empty. No witnesses to the blood. No one to see the cracks in the armor. He reached the threshold of his private study, his hand already moving toward the heavy brass handle. He needed a drink and the cold comfort of his leather wingback chair. But as the door swung open, the air in the room felt different, warm, smelling faintly of lavender and peppermint instead of cigars and old money. Luviano froze. His hand went instinctively to the small of his back, his fingers brushing the cold grip of his Glock. In the center of the room, bathed in the soft glow of a single reading lamp, sat a woman. She was small, her frame nearly swallowed by the oversized leather chair that usually held the weight of a criminal empire. She wasn't a hitman. She wasn't a rival. She was an elderly woman in a faded floral dress, her hands moving rhythmically as she knitted a section of bright yellow wool. "You're late, Luvi," she said, her voice a gentle rasp that seemed to bypass every defense he had built over 3 decades. "And you've been fighting again. Look at those hands." The guards behind him surged forward, weapons drawn, the red dots of their laser sights dancing across the woman's chest. Sheila screamed from the shadows of the corner, throwing herself forward to block the light, but Luviano didn't move. He stood paralyzed, his heart, the block of ice that had served him so well, shattering in his chest. The weapon in his hand felt suddenly, impossibly heavy. He didn't see an intruder. He saw a ghost. He saw the woman who had wiped his face in a Brooklyn alley when he was 8 years old and bleeding out. The knitting needles clicked softly in the silence, the only sound in a room where the most dangerous man in New York had forgotten how to breathe. The Brooklyn humidity of 1996 hung thick and sour over the asphalt, smelling of garbage and rain-slicked oil. 8-year-old Luviano was small for his age, a scrap of a boy with oversized eyes and a surname that carried more weight than his thin shoulders could bear. He was huddled behind a rusted dumpster in a jagged alleyway off Flatbush Avenue, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. The initiation had gone wrong, or perhaps it had gone exactly as the older boys intended. They had left him there, a broken doll in a designer shirt, his ribs aching and a deep gash above his eye weeping crimson onto the concrete. The world was fading into a hazy gray blur when the heavy metal door of a nearby kitchen creaked open. A sliver of warm, golden light spilled across the grime, followed by the scent of slow-simmered collard greens and smoked ham hocks. Sara had stepped out to dump a bucket of soapy water, her movements tired but steady. She had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know the sound of a wounded animal, and she knew the sound of a wounded child even better. She didn't ask who his father was. She didn't care about the crest on his signet ring or the black sedans that usually prowled the perimeter of his life. she simply saw a boy bleeding out in the dirt. With a strength that belied her age, she gathered him up, his small head lolling against her shoulder, and carried him into the warmth of her cramped apartment above the liquor store. For 3 months, that apartment became his universe. While the Udinesi family searched the city with fire and lead, Luviano sat at a small formica table, his wounds healing under the sting of antiseptic and the comfort of Sara's humming. She taught him how to sit up straight, how to say, please, and thank you, and how to find peace in a bowl of hot stew. She called him Little Lou, a name that stripped away the expectations of a crime prince and replaced them with the simple dignity of being loved. He remembered the way her hands felt, rough-palmed but infinitely gentle as she smoothed his hair. You aren't a monster, Lou, she would whisper when he woke up screaming from nightmares of the alley. You're just a boy who needs to be found. On the night his family finally traced his location and tore him away in a flurry of black suits and cold steel, he had reached out for her, his fingers brushing against the yellow wool of her sweater. He had spent the next 30 years becoming the monster the world expected, but he never forgot the woman who told him he could be something else. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the heavy velvet curtains of the Udinesi estate, but the atmosphere inside had already undergone a seismic shift. Luviano sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, his suit pressed and his knuckles bandaged, but the lethal edge that usually defined his posture had been replaced by a quiet, protective intensity. To his right sat Sara, humming as she spread thick layers of marmalade onto toast, treating the most feared man in New York as if he were still the scrawny boy from the Flatbush Alley. To his left, Sheila sat on the very edge of her chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Luviano cleared his throat, a sound that usually preceded a death warrant, but today it signaled a new law. He looked at the line of security guards standing like statues against the perimeter of the room. His voice was low, carrying the weight of a decree that would soon ripple through every corner of the 5 boroughs. From this moment forward, he began, his eyes locking onto each man in turn, this woman is sacred. She is the heart of this house. If a single hair on her head is harmed, if she so much as feels a draft because a window was left open, I will personally ensure that the person responsible erased from history. You do not just protect her. You honor her. The guards bowed in unison, their faces masks of disciplined confusion, but they understood the stakes. Luviano then turned his gaze to Sheila. The maid flinched instinctively, but the blow never came. Instead, Luviano reached out, placing a hand over hers. It was the first time he had ever touched a member of the staff with anything other than cold indifference. Sheila, he said, his voice dropping to a tone of raw sincerity. You brought her to me. You kept her safe when I couldn't. In this world, blood is supposed to be everything, but you've shown me a loyalty that transcends it. You are no longer a servant in this house. He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as Sara reached over to pat his cheek. You are my sister in all but name. My resources are yours. My protection is yours. We are a family now, and God help anyone who tries to come between us. Sheila's breath hitched, a sob of pure relief escaping her throat. For the first time in her life, the shadow of the king didn't feel like a threat, it felt like a shield. As Sara slid a piece of toast toward Luviano and told him to stop scowling, the new order of the Udinesi Empire was signed not in blood, but in the quiet, reclaimed warmth of a debt finally paid. The transition of the Udinesi estate from a silent tomb to a living home happened with the sharp clink of a wooden spoon against a ceramic bowl. Luviano, a man whose scowl could halt a federal investigation, found himself staring down at a mountain of steamed kale and poached salmon with a look of genuine betrayal. He reached for the salt shaker, his hand moving with the practiced precision of a marksman, only for a small, wrinkled hand to swat his knuckles with surprising force. Blood pressure, Luvi, Sara stated, her voice broke no argument as she adjusted her spectacles. You live a life of stress and shouting. You do not need the sodium. Eat your greens. Luviano looked toward his lead enforcer, Marco, who stood by the door. The giant of a man, who had once taken a knife to the ribs without flinching, suddenly found the crown molding of the ceiling fascinatedly interesting, refusing to meet his boss's eyes. Luviano sighed, a sound of pure defeat, and took a forkful of the kale. The King of New York was being governed by a 5-foot-tall woman in a floral apron, and the most terrifying part was that he was obeying her. The domestic shift didn't stop at the dinner table. Later that afternoon, Luviano was on a high-stakes conference call, his voice rising in a gravelly snarl as he dealt with a shipping delay in the harbor. I don't give a damn about the Port Authority. If that cargo isn't moved by midnight, I'll have every one of those bastards. The door to the study creaked open. Sara walked in with a duster, shaking her head. Luviano froze mid-sentence, the phone still pressed to his ear. Language, Luviano Udinesi, she chirped, flicking the duster at a priceless Ming vase. A gentleman doesn't need to use the gutter to make a point. Put $1 in the jar. Luviano stared at her, then back at the phone, where the terrified silence of his associates echoed through the speaker. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it into the empty marmalade jar Sara had placed on his mahogany desk for exactly this purpose. As I was saying, Luviano continued, his voice now eerily, politely calm, please ensure the delivery is handled with the utmost urgency. Thank you. He hung up and rubbed his temples. Sheila watched from the doorway, stifling a laugh as she saw the most dangerous man in the city slumped in his chair, looking less like a Mafia don and more like a teenager who had just been grounded. The devil was still there, tucked away beneath the tailored wool, but he was currently being neutralized by the one thing no bullet could stop, a grandmother's unconditional authority. Beyond the iron gates and reinforced stone of the Udinesi estate, the air in New York was growing thick with a different kind of tension. In a windowless social club in Queens, under the sickly yellow hum of fluorescent lights, a man known only as the Viper leaned over a graining monitors. He was a creature of the shadows, a rival who had spent a decade measuring the distance between Luviano's throat and his own blade. For years, the King of New York had been an impenetrable fortress, a man with no family, no lovers, and no visible mercy. He was impossible to leverage because he had nothing to lose. But the graining black and white surveillance footage from a long-range lens told a new story. The Viper's tongue flicked across his teeth as he watched a sight that seemed like a hallucination, Luviano Udinesi, the devil himself, carrying a tray of tea into a garden and sitting at the feet of an old woman. He saw the way Luviano reached out to steady her arm, the way his lethal eyes softened as he listened to her speak. He saw Sheila, the maid, laughing as she hung laundry near the perimeter, treated more like a sister than a servant. The king has found a heart, the Viper hissed, his voice a dry rasp that made the men behind him shudder. And a heart is just a target that bleeds. He didn't see a family, he saw a map of vulnerabilities. To a man like the Viper, kindness was a symptom of decay, and gratitude was a fatal flaw. He began to choreograph a new kind of war, one that didn't involve hitting Luviano's shipments or his warehouses. He didn't need to take Luviano's money to destroy him, he just needed to take the light the Don had so foolishly stepped into. While Sara continued to knit her yellow sweaters and Sheila began to breathe without fear for the first time in years, the shadows around the estate began to lengthen. Unmarked vans prowled the outer roads at midnight. High-frequency microphones picked up the sound of Sara's laughter and Sheila's singing. The Viper's gaze was fixed and hungry, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the ghost from Brooklyn and the maid who had brought her home. Luviano had built a paradise in the middle of a graveyard, forgetting that in his world, a man's greatest treasure is always his greatest curse. The piece in the house was a fragile glass ornament, and outside, the hammers were already being raised. The silence of the Udinesi estate was shattered not by a scream, but by the synchronized percussive thuds of flashbangs detonating against the reinforced glass of the conservatory. The midnight sky, usually a velvet backdrop for the mansion's opulence, was suddenly alive with the frantic strobing of red and blue light as the Viper's forces descended like a plague. This wasn't a street skirmish, it was a military-grade siege. Blacked-out SUVs tore through the manicured hedges, and high-velocity rounds began to chew through the limestone walls, turning the king's fortress into a gallery of falling plaster and shattered crystal. Inside, the transition from peace to war was instantaneous. Luviano moved with a predatory grace that years of domesticity hadn't dulled. He didn't reach for a phone to call the police. In his world, the police were just another audience. Instead, he drew the twin pistols that had lived in his desk drawer, their cold weight a familiar, grim comfort. Marco. Section 4 is breached. Get to the panic room, he roared over the deafening cacophony of small arms fire. The security team, men handpicked for their lethality, were being methodically dismantled. The Viper had done his homework. He knew the blind spots of the cameras and the rotation of the perimeter guards. One by one, the radio channels went to static. The mansion's power grid hummed and then died, plunging the hallways into a terrifying, infrared-lit darkness. In the center of the chaos, Sheila was a blur of motion. She had been in the kitchen preparing a midnight tea for Sara when the first explosion rocked the floor. Now, she was dragging her grandmother toward the reinforced library, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Faster, Nonna, please," she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the sound of heavy boots echoing on the floorboards above. Sara, however, didn't move with the urgency of the terrified. She gripped her knitting bag, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fires starting in the garden. She looked at the shadows dancing on the walls and saw the ghosts of the Brooklyn alleys she thought she'd left behind. Luviano met them in the grand foyer, his shirt soaked in sweat and the acrid scent of gunpowder. He looked at the woman who had saved him 30 years ago and the sister he had claimed just weeks prior. The front doors, 3 inches of solid oak and steel, shuddered under the impact of a battering ram. The devil knew then that his walls had failed. His empire was burning, his men were falling, and for the first time since he was 8 years old, Luviano Udinesi felt the cold, sharp edge of true desperation. He stood between the door and his family, a lone king in a crumbling castle, realizing that the siege wasn't just for his life, it was for his soul. The grand foyer was a symphony of destruction, the air thick with the chalky dust of pulverized marble and the acrid, stinging scent of spent gunpowder. The front doors had finally succumbed, hanging off their hinges like broken wings, and through the gap, the shadows of the Viper's elite hitmen filtered in with lethal, coordinated precision. Luviano stood at the base of the sweeping staircase, his chest heaving, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and grit. He was a king whose crown was made of lead and fire, but his eyes weren't on the invaders, they were anchored to the 2 women huddled in the alcove behind him. "Stay down." Luviano's roar was a jagged command, a raw sound that tore through the staccato rhythm of gunfire. From the wreckage of the entryway, a figure emerged, the Viper himself, a silhouette of malice holding a submachine gun with terrifying indifference. He didn't aim for the guards or the tactical points of the room. He leveled the barrel directly at the frail, silver-haired woman clutching a knitting bag. To the Viper, Sara wasn't a grandmother, she was the only piece of Luviano Udinesi that could be broken. "The devil found a heart," the Viper hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Let's see how it looks outside his chest." Time seemed to fracture into slow, agonizing crystalline moments. As the muzzle flashed, Luviano didn't think about his empire, his reputation, or the blood-soaked legacy of the Udinesi name. He moved with a desperate, animalistic speed that transcended strategy. He threw himself across the open space, his body a sprawling barricade of expensive wool and unbreakable resolve. The impact was a dull, heavy thud that stole the air from his lungs. The bullet, intended for Sara's chest, buried itself deep into Luviano's shoulder, the force spinning him around before he crashed to the marble floor at her feet. Sheila's scream was a piercing note of agony in the chaos, but Sara simply reached out, her wrinkled hands catching Luviano as he slumped against her knees. Blood, dark and hot, began to pool on the white stone, soaking into the hem of Sara's floral dress. Luviano looked up, his vision blurring, his teeth gritted against a pain that felt like molten iron. He saw the terror in Sara's eyes, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care that he was bleeding. He didn't care that his fortress had fallen. "I've got you, Nana," he wheezed, his fingers clawing at the floor as he tried to find the strength to stand back up. "I've got you." The hitman hesitated, momentarily paralyzed by the sight of the King of New York offering himself up as a common shield. In that heartbeat of silence, the debt of a Brooklyn alleyway was finally, violently paid in full. Luviano wasn't a don in that moment, he was a grandson, and his blood on the floor was the only proof of power that truly mattered. The copper-scented chaos of the siege eventually gave way to the clinical, sterile quiet of the Udinesi estate's private wing. Luviano lay in a bed that felt too soft for a man of his history, his shoulder encased in heavy bandages that restricted his movement but could not dampen the renewed fire in his eyes. He wasn't alone. Sara sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence that served as the heartbeat of the room, while Sheila moved quietly, replacing a vase of fresh lilies on the nightstand. The devil had bled on his own marble, but as the news rippled through the iron-gray streets of New York, the underworld didn't see a weakened king. They saw something far more terrifying, a man who had found something worth dying for. The Viper was gone, his syndicate dismantled in a single, surgical night of retribution led by Marco and the remnants of the Udinesi Guard, fueled by a fury that only comes from defending a home. But the true legend that began to circulate through the social clubs and back-alley docks wasn't about the gunfight, it was about the woman who had made the King of New York drop to his knees. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of an ancient debt, of a matriarch who held the soul of the Udinesi Empire in her weathered hands. The street gave her a name, the Ghost of Brooklyn. They said that to touch a hair on her head was to summon a wrath more absolute than any bullet. Luviano watched Sara, the way the morning light caught the silver in her hair, and realized that his power had never truly come from the men he commanded or the fear he sowed. It had come from that small, forgotten apartment in 1996 where a woman chose to see a boy instead of a monster. He reached out with his good arm, his fingers, scarred and stained by a lifetime of violence, gently brushing against Sara's hand. "No more running, Nana," he murmured, his voice thick with a promise that carried the weight of a blood oath. "You're home. We're all home. Sara paused her knitting, looking at him with the same piercing, loving clarity she had used 30 years ago. She patted his hand, a simple gesture that commanded more respect than any throne. About time you realized that, Luvi. Now, tell the girl to bring some proper tea. This hospital water tastes like pennies. Luviano laughed, a sound that felt foreign but right in the grand, silent room. The king was back, but the crown had changed. He had traded his isolation for a family, and his armor for a grandmother's love. As Sheila smiled and headed for the kitchen, the world outside understood a new truth. Luviano Udinesi was no longer just a man to be feared, he was a man who was finally, dangerously, complete. The legend of Sara had begun, and in the shadow of her kindness, the devil had finally found his peace. And that is where we leave them, Luviano, the man the world called the devil, finally at peace. Not because he conquered his enemies or expanded his empire, but because an old woman with knitting needles and a heart full of grace refused to see a monster when everyone else did. Sara never set out to change him. She simply loved him when he had nothing else. And Sheila, the quiet, terrified maid who smuggled her grandmother into a lion's den, ended up building the family neither of them ever had. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world isn't a gun. It's someone who remembers who you were before the world broke you. If this story moved you even a little, please give it a like and subscribe. It truly helps me keep bringing stories like this to you. Turn on your notifications so you never miss the next one. Thank you so much for reading all the way to the end. It means everything.